Given that one of my biggest sources of frustration with Red Faction was the difficulty of trying to track twitchy enemies with a sluggish, unresponsive crosshair, I became very interested in trying the PC version. A sluggish crosshair on console is a non-issue if you have a mouse, so maybe that would make it more fun? So I went ahead and bought it, now for the third time, along with another game I noticed was on sale from GOG.com, who, as they always do, erroneously charged me sales tax because they think I live in a state I don't live in, and they're apparently too stupid to add a billing address field to their checkout process so I could correct it, a solution that would be self-evident to even a very small, very stupid child. I want my $1.65 back, you twats, along with all the other times you've done this. The first thing that stood out to me about the PC version is that they completely removed fine aim mode. This may seem obvious, since the extreme precision that a mouse affords you renders it unnecessary, but remember that the main benefit of fine aim mode was not that it slowed down the crosshair, but that it removes all recoil and makes weapons magically accurate. You can't do that on PC. So where in the PS2 version the pistol is laser accurate in fine aim mode no matter how fast you fire it, on PC, you can only get the max accuracy out of the pistol by firing it really slowly, and even then it still has some spread. This also applies to the shotgun. On PS2, fine aim makes the shotgun's spread much narrower, which is nonsensical, but does make it useful even at fair distance. On PC, you can't do that, so the shotgun really only works at point-blank range. For the assault rifle, it felt to me like they made burst mode more accurate to compensate for this, but full auto still has tons of spread that can't be improved even if you fire slowly. So paradoxically, despite a mouse making it infinitely easier to aim, it's actually often harder to hit things because the weapons have so much spread. A more precise crosshair doesn't mean anything if the weapons themselves are hopelessly inaccurate. But this is only a problem until you get the precision rifle, since it doesn't have spread and fires very quickly, which, combined with the speed and accuracy of a mouse, lets you breeze through the game. And that leads me to the main point. The PC version is shockingly easy compared to the PS2. I was right in my assumption that having a mouse would completely change the entire experience, but it made things even easier than I expected. Simply due to being able to aim quickly and easily and not standing still so much since they removed fine aim mode, as well as having a constant high frame rate, I cut through the game like butter without even trying that hard. I played on medium, so it would be a direct comparison to my PS2 playthrough, and up to the fight with Capek, I only died a single time, and that was only because I clipped inside the submarine while getting out, and it essentially telefragged me when it moved. During the fight with Capek, I died twice, but both times it was only because I got hung up on geometry due to the less precise movement of a keyboard. But all three of those deaths were more technical errors than actually succumbing to difficulty, and thus did nothing to change the fact that the whole experience felt remarkably trivial. Once the mercs showed up, I died here and there for the rest of the game due to them being spongy, obnoxious, and having rail drivers, but the game still felt excessively easy. I got through the tram section that took me more than half an hour on PS2 on my first try and left with full health.
Code yellow alert. Intruder in tramway system. Level 2.
My original conclusion that the difficulty of the PS2 version was solely due to poor aiming mechanics was clearly correct. In a version where I can aim well, it's so devoid of difficulty that it basically plays itself, except for when enemies have rail drivers and kill you instantly. To put this in perspective, my PS2 playthrough took 13 hours, and my PC playthrough took me 3 hours and 20 minutes. Part of that difference is of course accounted for by the fact that during my PS2 playthrough, I stopped to examine things and talk about things, and on PC I didn't, but that only accounts for so much. The game just actually is that much easier on PC. It's also faster to scroll through weapons since they're now grouped by type, meaning you don't have to scroll past every single one linearly, and you can also bind specific weapons to specific keys. This made me change weapons more often, but nonetheless, I still ended up mostly using the precision rifle. The weapons simply aren't fun enough to warrant switching around, and some are flat out useless, like the riot shield and the grenades. Immediately after finishing the game, I started again on hard and played for a bit, but it didn't feel like resources were more scarce and the enemies didn't seem any tougher or more aggressive or better at hitting me. The only difference I noticed is that when they did hit me, it did more damage. On Impossible, they did seem better at hitting me, and it felt like they dropped less ammo, so that mode could pose a legitimate threat. Now, this difficulty disparity is the main thing to take away, but to make some smaller points without belaboring it too much, the PC version's audio output clearly has a compressor in place, and you can hear it squash the volume down when things get too loud. This prevents the sound from overloading and distorting the way the PS2 version does almost constantly.
Here's what mercs do to traitors, Hendrix.
A much better solution would be to mix the game with headroom in the first place, but it's still unequivocally better than having it distort and blow out every time something loud happens. Another audio change is that the PC team cut EOS off earlier on her "Together We Can" line, which totally fixes the problem I pointed out of it sounding like she was anticipating the cut. A minor change, but one I definitely appreciated.
Join us and strike back at Ultor. Together we...
All miners are ordered to ignore unauthorized announcements.
Join us and strike back at Ultor. Together we can...
That weird texture glitch still exists in exactly the same place. Smoke is visible through walls. In the elevator that fails and falls down the shaft, there's a small tunnel you can crawl through that opens to a landing with a sniper rifle on it, which allows you to have that weapon a little bit early. The collision on the giant fan is still broken, so you have to walk forward while it moves underneath you. The rock crusher with the sniper on it has a lever on the side you can flip to turn it on, presumably to kill the sniper, but I had already shot him long before I noticed it. At the bridge where I stood around and talked for a while, my speculation that you can shoot the lever was correct. You can shoot the lever right away, but if you stand around long enough, Hendrix hacks it for you. I'm not sure how shooting a lever laterally makes it move vertically, but it's fine. The stealth sections are still illogical and tedious. If I can shoot my way through every other area, I can shoot my way through the offices too, especially since the better aiming makes me more effective in combat. I could easily take every guard in the area if I had all my weapons. And beside the irrationality, it's just boring to have all my weapons taken away, especially when we shoot our way through the final stretch anyway, but without having the hardware to do it. The personnel suppression combots AI completely broke for me and it got stuck in the hallway. Then it didn't successfully fall into the pit, even though I had turned the fan on, but then inexplicably blew up when I turned the fan off. I played around with the flamethrower more, and it's definitely effective, though you don't get much ammo for it, but its downside is that enemy bodies burn for a long time, and walking over them hurts you. So if you use it on an enemy in a narrow space or by a door, which would be most of the game, you then just have to stand there and stare at their body until it goes out. The grenade's blast radius is still comically small to the point of rendering it useless, although I did discover that the alt fire on the grenade is a regular fuse that allows it to bounce and roll instead of exploding on contact. That could potentially be useful if it actually caused any damage. A fair way into the game, I encountered a persistent bug where many sounds just didn't happen. Gunshots would be silent while doors made noise, music would play but dialogue wouldn't, and so on. During the escape with Orion, the only sound was the car itself. This could just be a compatibility issue due to the game being much older than the computer I was running it on, which was a Windows 7 build from 2011 to 12. Compatibility issues with older software is the main weakness of PC gaming, but I also don't know for sure that that was the problem. At a certain point, it gave up completely and the only sound was ambience. Quitting and restarting the game did fix it, and it didn't happen again. The collision on the armored vehicle is just as broken, but the mouse allows you to turn it much faster, making the sequence far easier. The mirror effect in the bathrooms destroys the frame rate for some reason, which also may be a compatibility issue due to the game being old, and the highlight effect on the rail driver's scope seems to work at a much longer distance, although I didn't specifically measure the two. Also, I thought this line was kind of funny.
I'm out of medical supplies. Would you like a lollipop?
But importantly, this also gives me an opportunity to talk about the final stretch of the game, which I learned from Insanity itself after posting Part 6. I had done completely the wrong way. You are intended to do these right-angle hallways in the flying vehicle I really liked in Part 3, which are in this room here, and this also explains the lack of pickups I talked about since you aren't supposed to be on foot. Now, when I first played the game, I obviously saw these vehicles hanging from the ceiling, but I subconsciously dismissed them as scenery since they clearly can't be reached, so that must just mean the room is for show. There are countless other rooms where the stuff in them is purely decorative. However, in actuality, this control panel moves one of the vehicles to the ground where you can get in. I never noticed that this panel is interactable. Since I had already subconsciously dismissed the vehicles as scenery, I had no reason to assume this panel was significant. The game is absolutely loaded with control panels that don't do anything, so what reason would I have to think this one is different?
Code red conditions are in.
The rest of the plan is... Please, leave me alone!
Even re-watching that footage while editing it, it never occurred to me that I missed something in this room because I still just figured it was scenery. With the vehicle, the final section of the game is exponentially easier than doing it on foot the way I did in the playthrough, so the extreme frustration I experienced at the end of the game was partially my fault for missing this. However, I still consider this a failure of design on the part of the developers, because if they did want me to do this in the vehicle, then the onus was on them to design this in such a way that I don't miss it. It is the job of the developer to communicate things to the player, and there are ways to do that without literally telling them. You can communicate a lot simply with the placement of elements. In Half-Life 2 Episode 2, they explain in the developer commentary, which is extremely interesting, by the way, how they teach the player that the grubs drop a healing item. One of the first grubs you encounter is actually blocking your path forward, so you cannot progress until you kill it. guaranteeing that you kill it, but they also placed it above a slant, so the healing item it drops on death rolls down the slant, causing a very obvious visual movement that the player will instinctually chase. Upon picking it up, you hear the medkit sound and realize it's a healing item. From there, it logically follows that killing other grubs will produce the same healing item. The developers have, in a few seconds, communicated a very specific piece of information to you without saying a single word, and in doing so, have prevented you from simply dismissing the grubs as scenery and missing that they can be used to heal. Even so, it's almost inevitable you'd figure it out on your own anyway, as there are a few grubs before that one that you may have killed and found this out about, and there are tons of grubs past this one. So it would be nearly impossible not to notice at some point, but the developers still made it utterly unambiguous right away. The developers of Red Faction really needed to do something like that with this vehicle. In my original response to Insanity itself, I came up with two possible solutions. The first would be to put us in the vehicle in a cutscene where it happens automatically. Say, once we clear this room, the camera cuts and we just see Parker run up to a vehicle and then it cuts back to gameplay with us in it. It doesn't have to be an elaborate scene, just us running up to it. Basically the opposite of the one where we land with Griffin. The other option I came up with is putting a large gap in the terrain that can't be crossed on foot. This would make progress impossible until you have found out that a vehicle is available, and it can fly right over the gap. It took me a grand total of about 5 seconds to come up with those, so there is no reason the developers couldn't have thought of them in 5 seconds. Spending a little more time thinking about it, that is, a few minutes instead of seconds, it's still not hard, I came up with some more. An obvious one here would be to make control panels that are interactable look substantially different than ones that are just scenery. That way I wouldn't have walked past this panel because I would have learned by now that that design can be used. Instead, this exact panel design is scattered all over the game in unusable form. The only difference is that the usable ones have this switch with the green lights on it, but that's impossible to see at a distance in 480i. Why not just make the usable ones look substantially unique so that it's unambiguous? Another option would be to make the door out of this room a door that only opens for vehicles, so if I walk up to it on foot, nothing happens, prompting me to explore the room more, at which point I will eventually notice the panel. Yet another option would be to put the door in the ceiling so it's impossible to reach on foot, and this is precisely what they did the first time we used this vehicle, so clearly they had this thought already. So why not just do it again? The room even has one of those doors in the ceiling, but it's just for show and doesn't open. But probably the easiest and most obvious solution of all would be to have the vehicle already on the ground, at which point it would be self-evident that it's available. It really is that simple. Now, even in the vehicle, the rail drivers remain pretty problematic, as they are hit scans so you can't dodge them, and they do quite a lot of damage. But it's not particularly difficult to get to the end with a fair amount of health and ammo left. From there, you even get to use the vehicle against Masako, making her first form in the same kind of vehicle make much more sense. However, as soon as you destroy her vehicle, yours magically explodes and ejects you, regardless of how much health you had left, which is deeply preposterous. The vehicle would make her second form too easy, but rather than come up with something different, they just made it disappear and hoped you don't ask questions. So the latter part of the Masako fight has to be done on foot either way, though it's much easier to hit her with a mouse. I also discovered that once her shield is down, she dies in a single hit from the rail driver, so I was wrong in my original playthrough when I complained that she took an unrealistic amount of damage. I guess I was just missing a lot while I was at the mercy of auto-aim. It's hard to tell exactly where your shots are going in 480i with an inconsistent frame rate, and I was apparently not hitting her as much as I thought I was. But regardless, I concede that it is partially my fault for missing the vehicle and doing this section the ridiculously hard way, though I still contend that it was largely the result of poor design, because there are a number of trivial changes that could have been made to make it impossible to miss. And if you want me to do it that way, it needs to be impossible to miss. I'm all for hidden, optional things that reward exploration. That's fine, but the intended way forward is another thing entirely. All that being said, I still would have walked away from the game feeling pretty much exactly the same way I did. This final section being less difficult wouldn't change the fact that I had already grown sick of the game's mechanics hours before then. And the purpose of my videos is not to be a comprehensive, exhaustive overview of a game, but rather a record of my specific experience playing it. And in my specific experience, I missed that vehicle, and if I could miss it that easily, then other people could as well, and that's why I argue it should be designed differently. The moral of the story here is to play the PC version. It's fundamentally more responsive and smooth, and so you have more freedom to try different things. Instead of slowly creeping through the game and tediously camping corners in fine aim mode, I actually used a larger variety of weapons and even threw around remote charges from time to time. The mere fact that it wasn't as clunky gave a lot more latitude to the gameplay choices. On the other hand, I still don't think it's particularly noteworthy as shooters of the time go. It still almost entirely wastes its destruction engine, the weapons are still unsatisfying and lame, and I would still rather play Quake 2 or Jedi Knight any day of the week.